Welcome back to Tipping Point. I'm your host, Kara McKinney. Russia's President Vladimir Putin arrives in North Korea to great fanfare. Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a mutual defense pact today, pledging to help each other in the event of an attack. It's similar to an alliance treaty that the Soviets had with North Korea. But after Russia was rebuffed in its attempts to ingratiate itself with the West following the fall of the Soviet Union, it is now turning its eyes eastward for support, allegedly getting weapons shipments in exchange for food, medicine, and other humanitarian aid to Pyongyang. The West decided to make Russia a perpetual enemy instead of recognizing Moscow as a competitor, which can be worked with when it does benefit U.S. interests to do so. And so now Russia and China are overlooking their deep misgivings we used to exploit to keep them apart, and Russia is getting closer with North Korea. How does any of this benefit the U.S.? Since when does having a new axis of powers arrayed against us invite anything other than trouble? And why has NATO, now 75 years old this year, seemed to only stoke these tensions instead of to protect against them? Our next guest tonight co-authored just such a piece on this for the National Interest. It's titled, "Joe Biden's Ukraine Policy is Marching Toward Catastrophe." Joining us now to discuss is Jason Beardsley, a senior advisor for Concerned Veterans for America and a 22-year veteran of the United States Army and Navy. Jason, thanks for being here tonight.
Great to be with you, Kara. Thank you for that setup.
Great. So you write about how the French president, Emmanuel Macron, is openly floating the idea of NATO troops fighting in Ukraine. And then now you write Biden is allowing U.S. weapons to strike targets inside Russian territory. Do you believe this is marching us toward catastrophe, as the headline indicates?
These are alarming situations, and we've been warning veterans who are concerned about what's happening in this sphere, are concerned that escalation is the only course that we hear talked about from the administration. So rather than solutions for peace, negotiated settlement, what we're hearing are, as you said, further strikes into Russia, Macron teasing out the idea of NATO troops on the ground. Those are all bad scenarios for the United States to get embroiled deeper into a conflict that is on the doorsteps of Russia. It's far away from America. And meanwhile, our economy is hurting. So citizens are asking the question, where is the benefit for us, for Americans that are facing grocery bills and fuel bills that are too high, wondering how are we escalating in this conflict? And don't forget, America bears about 70% of NATO expenditures. That's 70% with 32 countries, meaning the other 31 share about 30% of that. This is a paltry, and it's time for us to shift how we think about overseas alliances.
It's true. And like you said, so when you talk about NATO, it essentially just means America, right? It just means our men, our money, our weapons, and the like. You know, you see some of these Baltic states, and obviously I understand why they have some ethnic tensions with Russia, given their history with the Soviet Union. But then today you'll see or hear some of these Baltic states saying, yeah, let's go after Russia. Let's fight them. Let's keep provoking this. Because when they talk about NATO, it's not them sending their, young men off to war. What they mean by that is America going off to go fight. And so as you write about in this piece as well, you write here, quote, "The prospect of alliance trainers on the ground," which is something we've heard a lot about, "creates a different high-risk, low-reward situation." Can you talk to us about,
Sure.
the issue that's presented by some of these alliance trainers? Because some may think, well, maybe that's a good middle ground, so we don't actually have to send troops on the ground, right? NATO troops over to Ukraine. Maybe having trainers to help train Ukrainian fighters, that might be a good balance. But as you say, high risk, low reward. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. Yeah. Trainers, is the ubiquitous form of the nose, the camel's nose under the tent. We saw this in Vietnam with Green Berets. I'm a Green Beret myself, starting to advise and assist in these roles that are proximal to combat, near combat, but that also puts them in harm's way. We saw this in Niger when Green Berets were ambushed and killed there. We've been doing it in lots of places, Somalia, other places too. The point of the piece is to suggest that while NATO trainers and advisors appear to be a light footprint, that same footprint, when you get American soldiers killed, coming home, being received at Dover, this is a concern for all veterans. I represent Concerned Veterans for America. We fought in the two overseas campaigns for 20 years, Iraq and Afghanistan, watching our treasure and our blood spoiled for no good reason, because you'll remember we handed those countries back to the enemies we were fighting on the ground. So the idea that we would have a better stake or a better reward for a proximal fight that is not ours. This is Ukraine's fight. This is Europe's fight first. but to put our men and our women and our services in support of this fight just endangers us because we can get sucked into these conflicts without purpose. This is how it often happens. We have intelligence assets on the ground, air assets, and air defense. So all of those things lead to the situation we see in places like Jordan when you have troops that can get killed, even though they're not in the fight technically.
No, that's definitely a great point to bring up. And, how often do we hear that if the U.S. doesn't do everything that we've been doing and more for Ukraine, that Russian tanks are going to be just rolling into Warsaw and Berlin and into Paris and, all of Europe? Well, if that were true, if they really fear that, then Europe would be pitching in far more money than they do currently. Instead, they just keep having America. We've been really the main financial backers of this proxy war. But I mean, it has backfired on us massively over these last few years since the initial invasion of 2022. I mean, as I was starting off earlier tonight talking about Russia now joining forces once again with North Korea, with China. Of course, we know their ties with Iran and some of these other nations. I mean, it's a huge axis now that is a pretty big bone to pick against the West. And it's like we just keep poking and prodding and building up this massive fight that right now we don't have the money for, we don't have the patriotism for, we don't have the recruitment and retention that we need in the military. It's really scary what we're dealing with. And just the other week, you had, the Russian Navy floating around Cuba doing military drills in the Caribbean, and then we sent our own subs to Guantanamo Bay, and we said it had nothing to do with what the Russians were doing, but we all can read through those diplomatic lines. So I say all this to point back to your piece that it really does feel like the Cold War right now, right? It's almost like a deja vu sensation.
And again, the American has the right to ask, where is the benefit for us? And you brought up a great point. The fear tactics are being used to gaslight us into believing that if we don't spend more of our taxpayers' monies and resources and risk American service members' lives here, then all of a sudden Russia will roll into all these other countries. But I'll be just a reminder that they didn't take Kyiv. In other words, they failed to take the capital of Ukraine. They're stuck kind of east of the Dnieper River. Maybe they get an oblast or two on the west side of it, but they're not likely to take a whole lot of terrain back. So the idea that they would next roll into Poland and next into Estonia and Latvia, that's a prospect we're not sure about. Nonetheless, as you point out, if that is the case, Europe would be kicking in a little bit more. And don't forget, Europe is still buying energy subsidies from Russia all the time. So one of the things the United States is trying to do here is de-establish the Russian preeminence for liquid natural gas into Europe. So we're trying to replace that. This is an escalation game, but it's a dangerous game.
And lastly, before I let you go tonight, Jason, you also have a piece for Newsweek, right? And you talk about NATO. So what do you think NATO has gotten right in this conflict, and where do you think that they have gone wrong? Because as you say in the headline, American lives are at stake if NATO does not set a better course here.
Well, we'd have to look at it from a couple different perspectives. If you look at NATO, if you listen to U.S. generals, Department of Defense, they're excited about how much they've learned at the risk of Ukrainian lives. Their Ukrainian generations are being killed right now. But our defense industry is really improving its technical capacity, its drone, how to fight warfare. We're trying to teach the NATO forces are trying to teach our battle tactics to the soldiers in Ukraine. But make no mistake, the people who are actually in combat in a conventional war with Russia, they're not fighting the tactics we learned and practiced in Iraq and Afghanistan. And another reminder, and I hate to do this, but our tactics in Iraq and Afghanistan did not lead to an enduring victory. So now you have the same generals who lost 2 wars in a row over in Ukraine telling them how to fight a 3rd war with a completely different landscape. So where does NATO benefit, you just said? Well, NATO's been able to get stronger, although there are schisms within the force, but they would be backslapping themselves and congratulating themselves for 75 years of what is called the international order and how they've kept the peace. But if you calculate peace as in endless wars and simmering conflicts all over the globe, you might be able to write that one off. The real truth is we are bearing the burden, American taxpayers, of this $3 and $4 billion a year budget to the tune of 70%. And then you add on top of that the actual conflict in Ukraine that's costing us over $140 billion. And I pointed out in the piece with Newsweek that we sent more to Ukraine in last year's bill than we did to our United States Marine Corps here in the United States. So that's what Americans are facing. Whether NATO could benefit from this or not, they all do because the United States is underwriting their defense. So they get the peace dividend, but the Americans do not.
Well, Jason, I really do appreciate and thank you for your analysis tonight, but I also do thank you for your service to this nation as well. Thanks for joining us.